Hey, hello, guys, and welcome back to my Cold War stories. And today, in our sixth lecture of the Cold War stories, I am going to talk about the assassination of U.S. President John F. Kennedy, or JFK for short. So he was president for a short period of time. So for basically for from 1961 all the way to 1963. So which meant he basically was the president of the United States for about 2 years, and so he was elected president in the November of 1960. So that was like shortly during the presidential election of 1960, which was between Kennedy and Nixon, Senator Nixon, and he would later become the president of the United States. And so during the during Kennedy's presidency, he was the president at the height of the Cold War, because that was when the Bay of Pigs and the Caribbean crisis took place during his presidency. And I'm going to go into more topics as I go further into the video. So you see, the Bay of Pigs invasion took place in April of 1961. So that was just shortly after Kennedy became president of the United States or inaugurated as president of the United States on January 20th, 1961. And so the Bay of Pigs invasion took place in April of 1961 when a Cuban exile team was trained by the CIA, the Central Intelligence Community, Central Intelligence Central Intelligence Agency. And they were trained by the CIA, and the Cuban exiles were sent to Cuba so they could overthrow the communist government of Fidel Castro. And so, but the invasion was a failure because the communists arrested the Cuban exile forces that were fighting against the Castro, and they were arrested and they were thrown into the jail. And so that was like a big failure for the United States to overthrow Cuban dictator Castro. And so later on, during most of the Cold War, that was basically when there was a bunch of assassination attempts on the Fidel Castro's life. And even after the Cold War, that was basically when even after the Cold War, there will be assassination attempts on Fidel Castro's life. And so after that, Kennedy faced another big situation, which was known as the Caribbean crisis, or the October or the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was in October of 1962, so a year right after the Bay of Pigs invasion. And so that was when Soviet Union placed missiles into Cuba because they were allies with Cuba. Soviet Union was allies with Cuba, which we now call Russia. And now Russia is a democratic capitalist country. So anyway, so shortly after this, the United States placed Jupiter nuclear missiles in Italy and in Turkey, which was right next to the border of Soviet Union. And so then the Caribbean, and then the Cuba was 90 miles away from Florida. So that was kind of scary for people of the United States, because that was close to Cuba. Cuba was close to the United States. It was 90 miles away from the Florida. And so that was like scary. And so it was, then the United States Navy had like a blockade of the island of Cuba, so they would prevent any Soviet ships from delivering nuclear missiles to Cuba. And so during that time, it was October 22nd of 1962. That was when U.S. President John F. Kennedy went on the television, and he announced to the public that the Soviets have nuclear missiles in Cuba. And so after this, it was on October 27th of 1962. That was when Soviet Union, under the leadership of Nikita Khrushchev, took missiles out of Cuba, and then that ended the Caribbean crisis, and that saved the world from nuclear war between the two great superpowers, the democratic capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. So a year right after this, after the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, it was in 1963. That was when the Moscow Washington headlines were established. That was when that was what to reduce nuclear talks, to reduce nuclear threats. That was established between Kennedy and Khrushchev, and they would talk on the phone to reduce nuclear threats between those two powers. And so at the same year, by the end of 1963, that was when President Kennedy's presidency was about to end because he was assassinated by Lee Harvey Oswald. And I'm going to go into more topics as I move on in this lecture. So, and then at the time, it was on November 22nd of 1963, and that was when President Kennedy, with his wife Jackie Kennedy, went to Dallas so he could run for president. So he could run for president in 1964, and that was when the next presidential elections was going to be for Kennedy and for Kennedy, so he could run for a second term as president. And so Kennedy arrived in Dallas, and he was in a presidential van. He was being escorted to Dallas. I think that's what the place he was at the time. And so gunshots were heard at 12:30 a.m. and that p.m. That was when shots were fired at John F. Kennedy's. The first bullet went into his neck, and then the second bullet went through his head. So that's how he was killed after that. No, he was injured. He wasn't killed yet. He was just injured. He was thrown into the hospital. That was where he was hospitalized for some time. And then half an hour later, he was declared dead by the hospital. And so after that, that was kind of shocking for the United States because Kennedy was the youngest president to be assassinated. He was at the age of 46 when he was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald. And so after the assassination took place, Lee Harvey Oswald left the scene. And then he went to the Dallas theater, from what I recall correctly. And so later on, it turned out that the police found a sniper rifle, which was a Carlonola gun, from what I recall correctly. It was this Italian sniper or rifle. That's the weapon that Oswald used to kill John F. Kennedy. And and then before the assassination took place, he went to the USSR in the 1959. He defected to the USSR in October of 1959. And so that's where he became that's where he learned Russian, and he became a Marxist, from what I recall correctly. He was interested in Marxism, I think. And so, and he married a Russian Soviet wife, which was in 1960. It was in March of 1961, so that meant like 2 months after JFK was elected president of the United States. And so later on, the police arrested Oswald at the Dallas theater, and he was arrested by police that same day. And so I think it was 2 days later, I think it was on November 24th or November 24th of 1963. That was when the assassin of JFK was shot by a man named Jack Ruby. And Lee Harvey Oswald was declared dead 2 minutes after he was killed, 2 hours after he was killed, shot by Jack Ruby. And so I think Jack Ruby was arrested for shooting at Lee Harvey Oswald at that period. And so following the assassination of JFK, he was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson, who was the president of the United States. Well, yeah, he was succeeded by Lyndon B. Johnson as the next president of the United States following his assassination, and then he would be succeeded by Richard Nixon. And then in the future lectures or the ongoing lectures, I'm going to talk about the Brezhnev, Carter, and Nixon, and the detente era, which all took place in the 1970s, which will be in my upcoming lectures coming up soon. which will all take place in the 1970s. So that was like 30 years after the Cold War began in 1948, from what I recall correctly. And so during this time, that was still when the Vietnam War was going on in Asia. That was fought between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and that was like a devastating war because a lot of American troops were dying there. And then when the American troops came home, they were being mistreated very badly. And in my next lecture, or lecture 6 of the Cold War stories, I am going to talk about the war in Vietnam, which lasted from 1955 all the way to 1975. And I'm going to talk about that in my next lecture. So thank you very much for listening to this lecture about the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I'll see you guys in the next lecture.